Thank you. I'm going to take us to a slightly different place over the next kind of few minutes. A number of people in this room have been involved in this program, but some of you haven't. So I just thought I'd better give a little quick outline in terms of what it actually is and is becoming a was. So the Water for Women Fund, as I said, is an Australian government has a DFAT funded program. It started at the end of 2017 and it finishes in the 30th of June this year. So it's been a 7.5-year program looking at water, sanitation and hygiene in sort of inclusive ways in 16 different countries around the Asia Pacific. So we work everywhere from sort of India and Pakistan through to Fiji and Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I just wanted to kind of give people that sense. We did that program. I'm in the role of what's called the fund coordinator. Our role was to sort of facilitate and support NGO programs in those various countries, as well as actually support the research organizations that were also a part of the program as well. So we had sort of about 90% of the funds went to actual implementation in countries, and about 10% went to actually research organizations. And those two groups actually worked very, very sort of closely together, which added a real sort of richness to the program. So it was nearly $160 million over that period of time. It started out with very much sort of a gender and social inclusion lens, and over the last couple of years, we've added that sort of climate resilient lens. So that gives you a snapshot just in terms of the context. So we've been talking a lot about sort of water resources and water utilities, and all those kind of things. A lot of the work that we were doing was actually in communities in those countries. So we're not necessarily talking about big, high-level infrastructure. A lot of it is kind of quite simple infrastructure, but really has that impact on the ground. But we also did work in some sort of informal settlements as well. So I always kind of think of Water for Women and AWP as kind of sister projects. One's looking at one part, one's looking at another part, but obviously they join up. It's not quite that silos, and we've worked together with AWP for a long time, especially with all of our conversations sort of at the global level. So that gives you a little bit of a snapshot. So just what I want to do over the next few minutes is draw out a few lessons. I could probably talk for all afternoon, but I won't. So just draw out some of those lessons and pick up some of those themes that we've actually been talking about over the last couple of days and just put a different sort of context and slant onto it. I got to draw my own slides. I think I've said all that, so I'll just move on. But that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the geographic spread. So we had 20 different projects delivered by 10 different NGOs sort of across that region. Okay, again, just final thing, and then I'll move on to some of the lessons. So what we were trying to do, improve health, gender equality, and well-being in Asian and Pacific countries through climate resilient and socially inclusive water sanitation and hygiene wash programs. That's sort of a big long title, but how can we actually impact those communities directly? But a really important part of it was not just working with communities directly, coming back to our panel yesterday. You need to go and work at the community level, but you also need to work at sort of subnational government as well as national government level. So that was the whole design of the program, was how do all those pieces actually fit together. And just a few photos in terms of some of the work we did. This was actually from COVID-19, making sure that all people get access to water and sanitation. So on to some of the key lessons. We talked a lot about sort of partnerships over the last day or two. Partnerships was very, very strong theme within sort of Water for Women, but we sort of approached it in some slightly different ways. All of our NGOs and research organizations were actually part of what we call the Fund Partnership Group, and that sort of provided strategic direction to the fund itself. So when COVID came up, we could actually respond. When we integrated climate risk and resilience into our program, we all worked together in terms of how best to actually do that. So it's just an interesting model that really explored sort of ways of working. How can we think differently about how we're working? It wasn't always easy, and there was lots of barneys and debates along the way, but we're all friends 7.5 years later. So that's a good thing. And some of them, Chelsea's in the room here. She wasn't necessarily at some of the barneys, but her organisation was, but we're still friends. The reason I say that, I say it in jest, but oftentimes partnerships, they are challenging, and you need to actually work through differences. We don't always all agree, and same themes as we came up over the last few days is having processes to actually work through those. That was a mechanism that we had within the program. But another really important part was actually that rolling down. How do we build the capacity of those local partners so they can actually deliver? They can continue on once our fund is actually finished. But because a big part of the fund was actually gender and social inclusion, bringing in those diverse voices. So working with rights holder organizations, whether they were people with disability, women's organizations, or some of them might have been semi-government women's organizations. How do you bring them into the decision-making process? So those were some of the ways that we actually looked at that whole partnership piece, and maybe some things for this group to actually think about and look at going forward. How do you continue to develop those partnerships and those processes with whatever those partners are that you're actually working with? Another important part was the whole collaborative learning. We had representatives from across the fund. We highlighted some various sort of areas where we thought was important to learn about collectively. And then we had representatives from different partners actually working on those pieces, bringing in NGOs, but also research partners, so that we were really strengthening and reinforcing what we were actually doing. So it wasn't just one country or one approach. It was how do those different approaches sort of come together, and what are some of the key lessons and principles that we actually can learn from that. And again, just some ideas in terms of the kinds of things that you can actually do going forward. Research was a really critical part of that, making sure we were building the evidence base around the implementation. And we have sort of a number of different pieces that actually unpack some of the value of having that research as an integral part of your work. And I think the other point that has come up over the last day or two as well is that two-way learning. We're not necessarily going in there as experts. There's people on the ground that have a lot of experience as well. There's people within those national and subnational organizations that bring their lived experience. Doesn't mean they have the whole picture. Doesn't mean we have the whole picture. But how do you actually bring that together? So it's creating that way that we can actually sort of exchange knowledge together. The collaborative leadership piece was also really important, and this became particularly important when we started to look at climate, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But bringing those different perspectives together, one of the sort of key examples I can think of is an integrated water resource management group that was set up in eastern Indonesia, and they brought in agriculture, they brought in water, they brought in health, they brought in some of their biodiversity work. So this is some of that coming together of water and sanitation and water resources more broadly. But they needed that to actually work through the solutions that were important in those contexts. In Papua New Guinea, bringing together a whole range of different sort of ministries to actually undertake the joint sector review. What was needed in PNG to actually improve water and sanitation, which, as we heard yesterday from Lucia, whether it's PNG or more broadly across the Pacific, they have really, really poor water and sanitation sort of statistics. So how do you bring those different bodies together in different forms to actually bring those different perspectives together? And one last sort of example, sort of water safety planning in Bhutan. And that was a great example of bringing government together with actually a woman who had never been to school, was not educated, but bringing her lived experience into those conversations with government. All of a sudden they realized those different perspectives that they actually had to navigate their way through. They call those collaborative circles, which I thought was a really, really nice sort of example. How do you bring an extremely diverse range of groups together or perspectives together to find the solutions? And the final point here before I sort of move on to the climate side of things, gender and social inclusion was very much sort of front and foremost of what we did. Looking at what are those targeted activities you need to do to bring different, whether it's gender, whether it's people with disability, other marginalized groups, into the conversations, not just them being sort of vulnerable and needing things. As Jackie sort of said earlier, yes, they are sort of most impacted, but how do we take that vulnerability and turn it into a capability? How do we bring them into the decision-making processes? So that was very central to what we did to actually support the building of resilience in those communities, and that building of leadership within the community, but also seeing those women leaders within the institutions as well. So if they could bring in those perspectives, and say the example of sort of a person with a disability, people may not even think that they have something that needs to be considered when actually putting in a water service or a sanitation service for those communities. So you might have a really simple example where they might actually put the water tap closer to the house with a person with a disability because it was easier for them to get to. Really simple kind of solutions, but did they actually realize that they needed to take those things sort of into account? And a big part of the whole program was very much trying to sort of tackle and change some of those social norms. What was holding people back from having women, people with disability, other marginalised groups part of those decision-making processes? And again, I'll use an example sort of from Indonesia. The governor of the district, he had a really strong wife who really wanted to support water and sanitation in that region as well. So she got all the women together and just to develop a program for them to actually do things. But the men weren't quite so sure about this whole thing. So she had them to dinner. They were going to be sort of talking about things. The first couple of dinners, all the men came. She didn't say anything. She didn't do anything. They just continued on their conversations while the men were in the room. The men sort of finally figured out there wasn't anything sinister about it. They were actually trying to do some good things, and eventually they stopped coming. So really thinking outside the square in terms of how you start to change some of those norms. Okay, so that's kind of some of the key lessons. That's sort of over the first 5 years. There's many more, but hopefully that sort of gives you sort of some highlights. But what I want to do now, and I'll skip over that. That's again a lot of women's leadership programs that were done sort of within all the various programs. But the last 2 years is very much focused on climate risk and resilience, integrating that into a WASH program. And what we really wanted to do is when we set out is when you have an existing sector, you've got existing themes, how do you actually bring some of those different sort of perspectives in and really trying to learn about that. Again, we sort of heard about that a range of times today, but how do you actually start to sort of systematically go through and look at what those climate risks are? And because we were working sort of community and sub-national level as well as sort of national level, there's all sorts of different data available in different places. So when you go in to do that, you need to see where your data and information is, but you also might not have any. So how you actually take what you have and try and adapt that to what you're actually looking at. As we go forward, I'm sure it will actually improve, but in some places you may just have that national level data. That's not very useful at sort of a small or community level, but that's when you can actually start to bring in some of those lived experiences. They might be changing, but I think a big lesson that we did learn is whoever you're talking to, you need to identify what's their perspective. What do they know? What do they learn? Really acknowledge that, and then together you can actually go on that journey to bring in scientific data or to bring in other information to develop those actually solutions. So it's been an interesting and challenging process. And I think the other big lesson is, especially when you're dealing at that sort of subnational community level, we talk about climate risk, climate resilience. That can mean many different things to many different people, and enabling people the time to go through and actually understand what that means. As an example, we heard last week when we were in Bangkok at a conference we were overseeing, they took 8 months to actually work with their various partners to help them understand climate risk and resilience. So I think it's not underestimating how much time it actually takes before you can actually start to implement things. The whole approach to climate finance, which we were sort of explored recently, that's our program sort of became 100% climate finance eligible. So principle, our main purpose was to actually address climate change. But I think without being sort of negative of the whole thing, it isn't necessarily the silver bullet, and there's potential unintended consequences if we don't actually look at that in a holistic way. Oftentimes the places where we're working, the systems are still evolving. You can integrate the climate risk in there, but you still need to continue to build that system. I mean, you start to look at the climate sort of definitions, and I won't come into all of that, but you might have a climate finance bit, but you still need to actually develop the system. Is that climate finance? Even though it continues and contributes to climate resilience, it may not fall into that category. So what may happen, if you're not careful about that, you could actually be using climate finance, but you're putting it on a weak system, and that's not going to be sustainable. So just making sure that you actually understand and unpack, and there's lots of learning to be shared there sort of over time. But I thought it was just a really important sort of point. It is complex, as our panelists actually flagged. It's a big pool of money, and as I said earlier, we need to be able to frame what we're doing to be able to input into the climate finance, to get people actually understanding why what we do is important, and that's an ongoing discussion. But we also need to be aware of the unintended consequences if we don't look at that. properly. Which comes sort of to my next point, that one of the big things we've sort of learned over the last little bit, people instinctively understand climate resilience, climate risk, and water. Something like sanitation and hygiene, not so obvious, even though sanitation actually, the studies have come out over the last few years, if you have ineffective waste management, that is contributing significantly to methane emissions. So those do need to be managed. And so that again, that sort of comes to that whole area where we're actually looking at where is the water and sanitation piece contributing to the climate problem, and where can we actually work to benefit that. But we've just noticed if people start to look at that whole climate risk side of things, if you don't have that continued emphasis on hygiene and sanitation, it tends to just drop. We don't want that to happen because that does have such a strong health implications sort of along the way. So again, just sort of interesting when we sort of looked at the last couple of years, that's what happened. So when we're looking at these issues, it is important to be particular in terms of what you're continuing to address. And then the final one is working globally to locally. The debate sort of brought that out very much sort of yesterday, and I think we've both with sort of AWP and ourselves have very much had that opportunity to work globally to influence the conversations. The water sector very much actually influenced the development of the global goal for adaptation, and it has water and sanitation as one of those sort of top key areas, as well as health, education, and infrastructure areas as well. So the water sector internationally has been doing a lot of work to make sure we're part of those sort of climate discussions, but that work needs to continue. But I think, again, one of the big lessons, and I think this then becomes sort of very relevant to people in this room, global conversations happening, we can go into communities and we know a lot of what they're doing is they look at things in a very sort of holistic way, but it's continuing to sort of work together and find those solutions in that, either the messy middle, as kind of what I call it. It's a very simplified way of looking at it, but we often are working in silos. We're maybe talking sectorally. How do we actually sort of, within all those different spaces, start to talk externally? And I think there's some examples, the example I gave from Indonesia and integrated water resource management committees that they've set up is bringing those sort of different perspectives together. So that is where we, as a whole group, need to continue to work. And it's an area where a lot of those global discussions really value that practical perspective, that practical implementation. They're talking globally and they have all sorts of different sort of perspectives, and they're doing all the right thing in terms of that global framing, but they don't always know how things work on the ground. And that's where sort of we as practitioners and policymakers, we can actually influence that and input into that. And we need to continue to do that, not only within our own sector, but as we said earlier, sort of more broadly as well. I think that was that's my few sort of highlights. I'll just see what else I added in here. Just out of interest, I won't go into the detail of all of this, but when you start to actually look at integrating climate into a program, there's lots of different kinds of activities you need to start to do. And that again starts to influence how you, that whole climate finance space. How do we link climate finance with other financing mechanisms? We looked at the blended financing side of things as well. But we're looking at water and sanitation, or whether we're looking at water, we need to recognize there's different kind of activities that we need to do to contribute to climate resilience, but they won't all necessarily sit in under that climate finance banner. That's just a couple of examples of things where we're starting to bring together the water sanitation, the water space, using some of that water resource seeking to bring that into the water and sanitation space. And that's it from me. Good, thanks.